I'm a threat to the official narrative.
Yeah.
And what archaeologists have tried to do in calling me dangerous and saying that I'm a threat to the official narrative is saying, goodness knows what's going to happen next if people start questioning us.
You're that dangerous, girl.
Yeah, apparently that day. My wife Santha and I have climbed the Great Pyramid 5 times.
Why?
Why?
Why did you want to climb the
I
pyramid?
think it is there to pose a huge question about our past. I think the pyramid was designed to make people think. And it was created by people who thought. I think there was a lost civilization of the Ice Age. I think there were survivors. I think they did attempt to reinitiate civilization, but they weren't quite able to do so. They created, if you like, secret societies all around the world, which persisted for thousands of years, initiates to whom knowledge was passed down, waiting for the right moment to switch civilization back on again. People need to think for themselves, and we're intelligent creatures. That's the essence of being human.
On se pose beaucoup de questions concernant nos origines. Si vous êtes comme moi, ça fait longtemps que je m'intéresse aux mystères de l'Égypte, de l'Atlantide, d'une civilisation perdue, engloutie. Graham Hancock est un auteur qui n'a pas eu peur de rentrer bien comme il faut dans cette question-là en faisant des recherches, des décennies de recherches. Il a écrit plusieurs livres. Ces livres sont des best-sellers. Le plus connu, probablement que vous connaissez, c'est L'empreinte des dieux, qui a vendu plus de 3 millions de copies à travers le monde, traduit dans 27 langues. Il y a maintenant une série sur Netflix qui s'appelle Ancient Apocalypse. J'ai eu l'honneur de le rencontrer aujourd'hui pour lui parler de toutes ses connaissances infinies sur tellement de sujets. J'aurais pu lui parler pendant des heures. On a fait ça en 2 heures. On est quand même pas pire. Si c'est pas déjà fait, suivez-moi sur toutes mes plateformes, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram et X, là où la censure ne sévit pas. N'oubliez pas de protéger votre vie privée quand vous naviguez Internet avec le VPN le plus rapide sur le marché, NordVPN, N-O-R-D. Abonnez-vous au nordvpn.com/Hello veut savoir et supportez ma chaîne tout en utilisant un des meilleurs VPN au monde. Je répète, NordVPN, vpn.com/ELOVEUT-SAVOIR.
You've drunk ayahuasca yourself.
Yes, and we're preparing. In 1 week, we have another.
I was very happy with the session I had in Peru just now. Firstly, because it was with the shaman who we first drank with 20 years ago. And
so Santa, you do it.
We always do it together.
Oh, that's
and we're upwards of sort of 75 sessions now.
Wow.
But this one, I focused my intention very much on a problem I have with migraines, which is ruining my life, actually.
That bad?
It's that bad. Every day, strong pharmaceutical meds. This time, just to keep me functional, since that session, I've only had 1 migraine, and that was 10 days ago. So I'm feeling
there's an improvement.
A massive improvement.
Do you think you went to the core?
I think so. I'm not sure why or how it happened, but I kind of trust Mother Ayahuasca.
Yeah, everybody calls her like that. That's interesting how it feels like a person when you encounter.
It does. There's a presence. There's an intelligence. There's an entity there.
Yeah, there's like a consciousness.
Yeah. There's a few tribes in the Amazon who regard the spirit of ayahuasca as male.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Huh, interesting. It feels very much feminine to me.
Almost everybody in the West encounters a feminine presence, and many in the Amazon do too. But there are a few.
So when you say you did it 75 times, was it always in the Peru or
no.
Did you?
We've drunk in London, but.
Not supposed to say it because it's illegal.
No, I don't mind saying that. It's just that. The sessions tend to be badly organized by people who don't really know what they're doing.
Oh, okay.
They don't understand we're dealing with a very powerful medicine here.
They're not shaman?
No.
So-called shaman?
No.
Okay.
Shamanism is a long process.
Right.
It's not something you pick up. When you used to be a drug dealer and now you find it. It's something you work at for a very long time. We've drunk quite frequently in Brazil. Okay. And in America too.
Nice.
Yeah.
What was your best experience? If I guess every experience is very different, but did you have one because of the place you were, or that felt more compelling to you?
The most important thing for me, which I'm still working on, is revealing my own baggage. and
Revealing.
my own baggage, the stuff I need to deal with. For example, the tendency to swift and unreasonable anger, which can cause pain to others. I've been shown that. I've been shown the pain my words cause. And it's not a magic cure, but it's made me think about it and think twice before I...
Do you complete it with psychotherapy? Do you feel like it's incomplete in itself?
I feel it's complete in itself.
Yeah.
And I still feel I have more work to do with ayahuasca.
It's never ending, is it?
But I'm not in a hurry anymore to have more sessions. If the time is right, the place is right, feels good, I will do it.
So you were in a hurry for a moment in your life?
Because it started out as a research project.
As a what?
As a research project. I hadn't, apart from, I mean, we can do this on camera if you want.
I think it's already started.
Oh, good. What happened was that I published a book in 2005 called Supernatural, Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind.
Yeah.
It's recently been reissued in the US under the title Visionary with a little bit of new information at the front and the back, but basically it's the same book. And that was, the fundamental mystery there was why is cave art and rock art all around the world so similar? Why are the same kind of entities depicted? Why do we see the same geometric patterns? And I became aware of a theory by a professor of anthropology, actually, in South Africa called David Lewis Williams. He calls it the neuropsychological theory of cave art. And he's arguing that really these similarities can be explained because all cave art, all ancient cave art at any rate, is shamanistic art. Shamans are depicting what they see in their visions, and those visions are brought on in altered states of consciousness. At that point, I hadn't had a lot of experience in altered states of consciousness. Many years before, I'd had one very powerful LSD trip.
Okay.
But I hadn't gone back to it. But my view as a researcher is if I'm going to write about something, I have to immerse myself in it. And then I discovered that in the Amazon, shamans in the Amazon were painting their visions. They would drink ayahuasca, they would return to the normal everyday state of consciousness, they would remember their visions, and then they would paint them. And lo and behold, those paintings had astonishing similarities with cave art from 35,000 years ago, from Peshmerga or Chauvet. Not only that, but the characteristic feature are therianthropes, and that is from the Greek therion, which means wild beast, and anthropos, which means man. Creatures that are hybrid, that are part human, part animal in form.
Okay.
You find these all over the ancient cave art. You find it in Chauvet, you find it in Peshmerga, and you find it in the Amazon today.
Interesting.
And that would suggest that the painters are seeing the same things.
Wow, that's fascinating.
And therefore I felt if I was to write this book authentically, that I needed to go to the Amazon and drink ayahuasca. And my wife Santa and I went down to Peru, and we had 11 sessions of ayahuasca there.
In a row?
Yeah, in a row, but over a period of about 3 weeks.
Wow, that's intense. Did you? My God, the first time I did ayahuasca, I swore to myself the whole time, never again, never again. And a lot of people I was with were doing it the next night. Yeah. And I felt sorry for them. Yeah. So I wouldn't imagine.
It's such a powerful and such an overwhelming experience.
Oh, yeah.
At the same time, it's a very interesting experience. And I wanted to get to grips with this visionary state. And it helped me very much to write my book. In fact, if I hadn't had those experiences, I couldn't have written that book authentically at any rate. It would have just been a piece of armchair theorizing rather than something based on direct experience. Yeah. Yes, it is physically hard work. There is the vomiting, there is the diarrhea, and it's also psychically hard work. You can be attacked in ayahuasca sessions. There is,
or afterwards.
There's this powerful psychic element to it, and the way I look at it is that there is good and evil in this world, and in the realms we enter in the ayahuasca state, there is also good and evil, and there, shamans in the Amazon and elsewhere are not necessarily, models of goodness and kindness. They're often people who fight each other. They fight on the psychic plane.
Really?
There's a lot of jealousy and envy.
There's a lot of ego going.
Yeah, and that too. So
they're humans after all.
Yes, they're humans after all. And what I think happens with ayahuasca is that your barriers get lowered. The protections that you put around yourself get lowered, and you become open to things that you were not open to before. But by and large, it's a positive experience. And what a good shaman will do if there is a psychic attack underway, we'll deal with that. We'll handle that.
So he will notice if there is a psychic attack going on. So for
Yeah.
those who are
that's why sessions in the West, where you have 100 people who are being managed by 3 or 4 other people, often go very badly wrong, because there's not the control and the care.
Yeah, there's too many people.
Way too many people.
So how many people were there when you were doing your sessions in Peru?
Well, when we first started in Peru, it was just Santa and myself and a shaman.
Wow, it must be so different.
Yeah, it's very different. And then later sessions in Brazil, maximum of 12 people.
That's nice.
The only curious one was the Unidade Vegetal in Brazil, which is an ayahuasca church.
Oh, wow.
I mean, first of all, kudos to Brazil and to Peru for recognizing ayahuasca as a national heritage.
Nice.
And for protecting its use under laws of religious freedom. There's no question of ayahuasca being illegal in these countries. No. And there have developed ayahuasca churches which have a kind of Christian element sometimes, or an animistic element. The Unidade Vegetal is one of those, and they handle an ayahuasca session very differently from anybody else we've ever drunk with.
Why is it different?
Well, first of all, a large group will come into a church-like building. They will before the session, they'll sit down and have pizzas, which I couldn't. Yes,
that is so weird.
They serve pizza
and they throw it up after.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay,
and it's a rather thin tea. It's not the very thick brew that you can sometimes get.
Oh, okay.
And then you drink the brew, and you sit in a chair like in a congregation, and then various people stand up and give addresses and talk about things that are on their mind. And the lights are on, and it's just very different from other sessions that I've done.
Oh my gosh.
I didn't love it.
I guess it's pretty weird.
I prefer to be flat on something reasonably comfortable.
Darker too, I guess.
I don't like bright light. I'd like to be in a darkened space. Where I can focus.
You can see from here, I guess, in a better way.
Yeah. And it's often the case. I think it's partly dependent on dose, but it's often the case that you can if an ayahuasca vision is particularly terrifying or disturbing, you can often stop it by opening your eyes. But if the dose is enough, and that was the case in my most recent ayahuasca session in Peru.
So you open your eyes.
It doesn't matter whether you open your eyes or not. It's
know.
still there. And I was dealing with 2 horizons on the ground. I could see the physical ground in this realm, but there was another ground covered with plants all above it.
So it was a big dose that you got.
It was a hefty dose, and it made maneuvering a little bit complicated. Like if I needed to walk to the toilet or anything, what is the... Yeah. What is this?
You're crawling there.
Yeah, but we're in the sessions to have this experience and to see. I do regard ayahuasca as a teacher, and that's primarily what it's about. It's an enormous mystery.
It is.
What is going on here when we drink this brew? Is it just our brains on drugs? A lot of people will say that. A lot of scientists will say that.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's got the answer. My view is that we are altering the receiver wavelength of the brain, that reality is much more complicated and much vaster and stranger than we imagine in this limited frame
3D, yeah,
to which we confine ourselves, and that it allows us access to other levels of freestanding reality. I'm often regarded as completely nuts for saying that, but the people who regard that as nuts have never drunk ayahuasca themselves. Entry into, I think, to put it in scientific terms, for me, it's like encountering a parallel dimension.
Right.
I've been shut off from.
It really feels like that.
Yeah. And that dimension has its own reality. Now, when we define reality in our society today, if 20 or 30 people all say that something is real, we tend to say, okay, it's real.
Yeah.
And this is the case with ayahuasca, that huge numbers of people have very similar kinds of encounters, and particularly this entity that so many of us call Mother Ayahuasca, this feminine presence who is a teacher and whose practice is tough love.
Yeah, very tough love. Yeah, I didn't experience like anything but tough love with ayahuasca, so I'm hoping that my next journey will be easier. The first time it was really, really hard. But the thing is that, because people ask me after, why did you go back? Like, what are you seeking? And I was like, the way I felt afterwards, not while I was on ayahuasca, but I remember feeling so light, so relieved from like a very heavy baggage I was carrying. And I knew I was through with it. Like what I had dealt with during the ayahuasca, I knew I was done with.
Yeah.
And I believe in psychotherapy. I studied psychotherapy, but I feel like it's like a shortcut. Like it's very intense, and you just dive, and you have to surrender.
You have to surrender. There's no point in trying to fight it.
No, if you do, I think you're just going to regret very badly.
I compare it in that sense to the ocean. My wife Santa and I have done a lot of scuba diving, years of it, and we realized pretty soon you don't disagree with the ocean.
Oh no!
You go with the ocean.
Yeah,
you don't try and fight
current.
the ocean.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same with ayahuasca.
Yeah, it's a very bad experience if you go against the current.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about that because you openly talk about your ayahuasca experience, and we know you as someone who's going against the official narrative about our history, about our ancient culture, and as you know, I'm fascinated with pyramids, with ancient Egypt. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated with Atlantis, and that's why I really enjoy reading your books, and I enjoy your show, and
thank you.
I follow what you're doing because I'm interested in those things, and I don't think I'm the only one. I had Oliver Stone on my podcast, and he was telling me he considers himself a truth seeker. He hates the word conspiracy theorist. And I consider myself a truth seeker, and I think that's what you are as well.
I hope so, yeah.
You seem to be searching for the truth, and I think there's some common ground with the ayahuasca or any searching for the inner truth and searching for the truth out there in the world is somehow connected. Do you think it's the same motivation for you?
I do think so, especially when there are so many forces at work in our society which are attempting to create a dominant narrative. Which are attempting to define how people should think, and I think it's important to have some alternative to that. I think it's important to challenge that, because where societies fall into a single-minded way of thinking, which is controlled through a hierarchy, it can be dreadful. The consequences can be absolutely awful.
Well, I feel like we've tapped into it during the pandemic.
Yeah.
I was telling you just before we started, but in Quebec it was 3 very long years. And I feel like since the very beginning of the pandemic, I was in the outsider camp. Like I didn't really buy it. I felt like they were selling so much fear. And to me, fear is not, it can be the place where you take the good decision.
Yeah.
So I was like, can we just calm down?
Yeah.
But it was never an option.
No.
Calming down. And now it's just like, it feels like we're rolling onto this wave of, instilling a lot of fear and anger and hate and division.
And using it as a tool to create obedience.
Exactly.
If you want an obedient population, you have to persuade them that it's their own in their own interests to be obedient. And that's the way that the whole COVID issue has been used.
Yeah.
As I said before we started talking, I don't have any evidence that persuades me that COVID was artificially or deliberately released. Perhaps it was, perhaps it wasn't. But I do have definite evidence the powers that be, the governments throughout the world, used the opportunity of COVID to inculcate a habit of obedience in the population and to make the population feel that was in their own interests. There were all sorts of things. In Britain, we had people standing outside their houses every Thursday night at 5 p.m. and clapping the National Health Service for all the wonderful work they were doing. Wow. This is a step towards tyranny. Once we start doing this, people need to think for themselves, and we're intelligent creatures. That's the essence of being human. And if we're to think for ourselves, then we don't just need one narrative. We need multiple narratives, and we need the controlling dominant narrative to be challenged again and again and again.
And that's what you're doing so well.
I hope so. I mean, my particular focus has been on ancient history, but also on the nature of reality. You know,
Exactly.
what is this thing that we call real?
So before you've been a journalist before you started writing books.
I was,
for mainstream media. So you wrote for The Guardian, I think.
I did. I started my sort of working life at the age of. I left university at the age of 23, and that was in 1973. And in 1975, I traveled to Somalia with my first wife, and I lived in Somalia for a year. My first wife was from Somalia. I met her in England, but we traveled to Somalia and spent a year there. And I kind of had the opportunity to immerse myself in Somali culture. Somalia in 1975 was not what it is today.
Was it better?
It was far better.
Okay.
It was a very open, free society.
Oh, wow, okay.
There was a dictatorship, but the dictatorship was very limited in its outreach.
Okay.
Basically, as long as you didn't get in the face of the dictator, you could do whatever you wanted.
Okay.
And I found it's bizarre and contradictory to say so, but I found it extremely free. I had a wonderful time there.
Nice.
And I immersed myself in that culture, and began to submit freelance articles from Somalia to various newspapers and magazines. When I came back to England, I got a job on a magazine, which was called New Internationalist, and it was a magazine that took a radical stance on the whole issue of foreign aid and development. It was an interesting thing for me. It gave me insight into how magazines are made, into the whole production process. It involved a lot of travel, and all the time I was freelancing as well. So even though I was working for New Internationalist, well, actually, I told them I was taking a holiday. I was going away for 2 weeks, but I got a deal with the London Sunday Times to go and report the war between Somalia and Ethiopia, the Ogaden War in 1977. And I didn't come back in 2 weeks. It took me about a month to get through that. And I had an amazing experience, published a number of reports in the Sunday Times, and I gradually built up a bit of credibility as a correspondent. And eventually in 1980, maybe early 81, the Economists appointed me as their East Africa correspondent based in Nairobi in Kenya.
Wow.
And I do always point out that may sound very grand, but it wasn't.
No?
I was a stringer. I was paid 50 British pounds a month as a retainer.
Ouch.
And anything I earned would be based on the number of words I wrote.
Oh.
And typically an Economist story is 300 words. So
That's not a lot.
I wasn't making a lot of money, but it opened doors.
Yeah, and you were building your reputation.
I was building my reputation, and I traveled very widely around East Africa, and I became particularly a specialist on Ethiopia and on Somalia.
Oh, wow.
And I regarded myself as very much as a current affairs journalist.
So I find it kind of interesting because you started pretty mainstream, and then you started tapping into subjects that are shaking maybe a little bit the official narrative.
Well, the first time that really happened.
The Sign and the Seal.
Well, no, it was actually still very much on current affairs, and it was a book that I published in 1989 called Lords of Poverty.
Okay.
The freewheeling lifestyles, power, prestige, and corruption of the multi-billion-dollar aid business. My travels had shown me that aid is not help. That aid empowers those who are already in power and very rarely reaches the poor who actually need it. That it's funneled through huge bureaucracies, and that it is almost useless in everything that it does. So there I found myself being a contrarian, because at that time criticizing aid was like criticizing motherhood. It's something you weren't supposed to do. I published a very critical book about foreign aid.
How was it received?
Surprisingly well, actually. I think it was beginning to dawn on a lot of people at that time that the way aid was structured was not necessarily helpful at all.
So it was acclaimed even in the mainstream media?
Yeah, it was, and perhaps that was because it partly fitted some mainstream agenda at that time. I'm not sure. It was acclaimed in the mainstream media, but I was just telling my truth. I was just telling what I saw.
Yeah.
And I was looking at the statistics, and I did a lot of research for that book, and visited many areas that were receiving aid and saw how useless it was actually in helping people.
That was important.
Perhaps the reason the mainstream didn't dislike it was because I made the point that none of the rich countries in the world today got rich because they got aid. Maybe that fitted into a mainstream narrative. I'm not sure.
Maybe you didn't do it on purpose, but that worked out.
That's how it was. But my view was very contrary to the general mainstream view at that time.
Yeah.
Round about then and through the 1980s, I had stumbled across the Ethiopian claim to possess the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
A very different type of story.
Yeah.
And that story intrigued me. Once I got to grips with it and realized that there was substance to it, although all academics were claiming that it was complete nonsense. I don't see how an entire culture can be just dismissed as complete nonsense.
So the entire culture would be the Ethiopian culture?
Yes, the Ethiopian culture, both Ethiopian Christians and Ethiopian Jews. We have to remember that there is an indigenous Jewish population in Ethiopia, the origins of which are extremely ancient. They're called the Falashas. They call themselves the Beta Israel. And they have their own story about the Ark of the Covenant. And I investigated this whole matter in great depth and eventually ended up writing a book called The Sign and the Seal, A Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. And that actually didn't annoy many people either.
Exactly.
But I wasn't really... I was saying, look, I think the academics are wrong to dismiss this as pure fantasy and folklore. There has to be some substance to it.
But there was room maybe to critique back then that is no longer here.
I'm not sure. It was what I wasn't doing is in that book is saying that the whole structure of history as it is given to us by the mainstream is based on false foundations, and that's what I came to next with Fingerprints of the Gods that I published in 1995.
Yeah, you were all in with this one.
Yeah, that the house of history, as I call it, was built on very flimsy foundations.
Well, I think that's the core of your work. You demonstrate in a very simple way that what we're being told lies on nothing.
Lies on nothing. Generally speaking, where history is based on solid documentation, we can be reasonably confident, not totally, but we can be reasonably confident that it's okay. But when you get into prehistory, when you get into the time before documents have survived, it becomes much more difficult. For example, we have the Indus Valley civilization in India. It had a written script, but it's been impossible to decipher it. Nobody can translate that script.
We don't have the code to...
No, we don't have the code. And unlike ancient Egypt, where we had the Rosetta Stone and it was possible to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs, in the case of the Indus Valley script, nobody has ever succeeded in translating it. So there's a whole story about ancient India, which is in written documents, which go back 5,000 years or more, but which nobody can read.
That is so sad.
And then you're left what? You're left with archaeology, which primarily bases itself on whatever small amounts of material they can dig out of the ground in whatever small areas of the world they happen to look at. And suddenly we're dealing with something very flimsy rather than something very strongly. And archaeologists may say, we've got history nailed, we understand prehistory, we understand everything. They often do say that, but they don't.
Are they saying that?
Well, they certainly are.
Okay.
In my case, the critiques of my work by archaeologists, I'm suggesting, and I emphasize, I'm suggesting, I'm not insisting.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting that there's a forgotten episode in human history.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting that, put it in plain language, that there's been a lost civilization. And even the notion of a lost civilization should not be too surprising to archaeology, because to go back to the Indus Valley civilization, which is now recognized as a civilization, nobody knew that such a thing existed until the 1920s, when some accidental discoveries in what is now Pakistan made it clear that there had been a huge civilization there. So that was a lost civilization that was found. I think we're dealing with something very different during the Ice Age to what is presented to us by mainstream archaeology. And a lot of my work over the last 30 years has been focused on trying to make that case, that we've lost an important part of the story. I use the phrase that we're a species with amnesia. And that's not entirely original to me. Velikovsky wrote a book called Mankind in Amnesia, and really I just developed that idea further. That there's a sort of black hole in our past upon which archaeology has imposed a narrative. And that narrative is that our ancestors were not stupid, but simple hunter-gatherers with a non-complex society and with relatively limited knowledge of the state of the world in which they live. I found a lot of evidence which suggests that 10,000, 12,000, 15,000, 20,000 years ago, maybe 30 or 40,000 years ago, there were cultures that had knowledge of complex astronomical phenomena, cultures that had knowledge of the size and dimensions of our planet, who knew the polar radius of the Earth and the equatorial circumference,
the Great Pyramid,
and manifested it in the Great Pyramid on a scale of 1 to 43,200.
So impressive. And the official narrative would say that this is just random.
Yes,
a coincidence.
Just random, just a coincidence, and something to be ignored, because archaeologists are so sure that they've got prehistory right. Whereas I would say archaeologists have got a lot of prehistory right, but they've also got some very fundamental factors about prehistory wrong, in my opinion. And therefore it was interesting to me. I've been under attack by the archaeological community and by their friends in the media, really since I published Fingerprints of the Gods.
Oh, okay, that's when it started.
It really started then, right from the beginning.
But it was a bestseller at the same time.
It was a bestseller, and that was why I was under attack. You see, if my books weren't bestsellers,
no one would bother.
Very few people read them. Why should archaeologists bother with me?
Yeah,
I was challenging their narrative.
You were, because you say archaeologists attack me, but you were also challenging them in a way that probably forced an answer or something.
Well, they felt they had to respond because I was getting some public acceptance of what I was saying. And this is something that needs to be understood, is that there is a dominant narrative about the human past, and in that sense, it's not so different from the control that is exercised by governments or large corporations on the way we think. Control is exercised on the way we think about our past. Archaeologists get very angry with me because they say I have a large platform. My books have been read by millions.
Yeah, that's one of the things I read of it. They are criticizing you for having a large audience, and when they publish a paper in a scientific review, nobody reads it. Exactly.
So it creates a lot of envy and a lot of jealousy, as a matter of fact.
What do you answer to those who say that you don't have to be peer reviewed because you're not a scientific?
Well, who are my peers? I mean, will I be reviewed by other journalists?
Well,
I don't claim to be a scientist. I don't claim to be an archaeologist. I don't claim to be an academic. What I claim to be is fundamentally a journalist, but an advocate. And perhaps that's where I vary from. Well, that you could say that's where I vary from most journalism, but actually, if you get to grips with a lot of journalism, it is also advocacy. Journalists do advocate particular causes or particular points of view, and the point of view that I'm advocating is that we need to take another look at prehistory. And much more careful look, and the fact that I have a large platform, the Netflix show Ancient Apocalypse, obviously was seen by tens of millions of people.
It was number one for several years in
many
countries.
It was a huge, probably one of the most successful documentary series that Netflix has ever made, and this thank you. This infuriated archaeologists because here's Hancock, who they disliked anyway, who now has this massive worldwide platform, but. The point I'd like to make to that is that that actually archaeology has a massive worldwide platform too. Yes, individual papers written by individual archaeologists may be read by a few dozen people, but it goes deeper than that. Everything we learn about prehistory from the moment we start going to school is based on what I call mainstream archaeology. There's no alternative point of view in there. If you read books about ancient Egypt that are aimed at children, they're all based on what archaeology has decided was the case. And that continues all the way through the education system, continues through high school, continues through university. Most journalists, if they ever bother to investigate the past at all, will talk to archaeologists and will report the points of view of archaeologists. So actually, it is a dominant narrative. And no matter how large my platform may be, it does not compete with the size of the platform that archaeology has in imposing a particular narrative.
Creating the official narrative, basically.
Creating the official narrative, which is often accepted without question as being true, because after all, these are archaeologists, they're good people, they've devoted their whole career to it, they're specialists.
Well,
why
that's
should
the
we
thing.
disagree with them?
I'm trying to figure out, because I really try to understand the other people's point of view, and I'm thinking, if I'm studying to be an archaeologist, that's because I have a passion for archaeology. I'm curious. I really want to understand the past. So when I'm faced with the facts that you are presenting in your books or on Netflix, you know, like, to me, I went to Egypt with my husband. I love Egypt. And I was in the Great Pyramid. I was thinking, there's no way it was... I don't think there was ever a dead body in this pyramid. Like, it doesn't feel like that.
There's absolutely no evidence
it's based
that there
on
ever
nothing,
was.
but there's no inscriptions on the wall. You know, when you go in the Valley of the Kings, it's all over the place. The hieroglyphs, and you can feel it's just like it comes from a different era completely.
But mainstream archaeologists will tell you it was a tomb. And only a tomb?
It has to be a tomb.
And for a specific pharaoh at a specific time.
And you don't find his name nowhere. And, you know, there are so many things when you start digging that makes no sense. And that's where I get mad personally, because I feel this is my past too. I'm a human. And I want to remember where I'm from. I really feel, when you say species with amnesia, I really feel like it's like I'm scratching my head trying to remember. Like, I know there is something missing. I feel there is something missing ever since I was a child. And I feel like someone, I don't know, or a group of people are depriving me from knowing my past, and that's so frustrating.
And I hope that that's where my books and presentations have been useful, is that they've helped people to gather the courage to slip out from under the dead hand of archaeology and think for themselves about the material.
Well, I guess most people don't even know, like, the things you're presenting. Most people don't know that, you know, the Cheops is not even named in the pyramid, or most people don't know that. So when you say that, and then I'm like, why do they all agree on an official story if it's based on when? Like, that's where I can't understand. I'd like to speak with an Egyptologist to try to really understand their mindset, because I don't really get it.
I think the problem is that archaeology is a profession like any other profession, and it has established certain guidelines and rules about how people should think. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think archaeologists are putting their heads together to deceive
I don't think so either.
the public about the past. I think it's just the way that professional organizations work. If you once a dominant narrative has been achieved, if you don't accept that dominant narrative, if you start to fight against it,
and
then you become an outsider, and you're unlikely to have a very successful career. There was a case of an American archaeologist who has very interesting findings on the peopling of the Americas and on the ancient peopling of the Americas. And he was told if he did an interview with me, he would no longer have any association with his university.
You're that dangerous, Graham?
Yeah, apparently that dangerous.
Wow.
And the reaction to my Netflix series from archaeology was literally to say, in print, we know there was no lost civilization. We know there was no civilization during the Ice Age.
How arrogant.
It's incredibly arrogant, and how can they possibly know that?
Science
they
doesn't know.
that
Science
may be
is
their
supposed to
opinion.
doubt. Yeah, that's an opinion.
And they're welcome to it, but they don't know that.
No, they were not
and
there.
I think it's important to be clear here that there are huge areas of the world that have never been studied by archaeology at all. And the areas that I point to...
Underwater?
Yeah, most prominently.
Yeah.
Are the 27 million square kilometers of land that were submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. 120 meter rise in sea level at the end of the last ice age. That submerged 27 million square kilometers of the best real estate on Earth that was above water during the ice age and is underwater now. And relatively little work has been done in marine archaeology. And when it is done, it tends to be focused more on material from the historical era, like shipwrecks, for example. These get a lot of attention from marine archaeology. Then you have another enormous black hole is the Sahara Desert. Sahara Desert was green during the Ice Age.
Yeah.
There were periods during the Ice Age when it was extremely fertile, when huge rivers and lake systems existed in the Sahara. Now, when the Northern Hemisphere was a frozen, true desert, I mean, really, Northern Europe and much of North America were uninhabitable during the Ice Age. It was so cold, so arid, so unpleasant to live in. The natural tendency would be to migrate to warmer zones. And the Sahara Desert, yes, there's been some archaeology there, but very little by comparison with the roughly 9 million square kilometers that the Sahara Desert covers.
And I think there's also there are two examples that I'm sure you're very aware of, but underwater, in the Cuban coast, in 2001, they went there. They were trying to find gold, I think. Yeah. And they finally found a city that seemed to be submerged by water.
Which has rather disappeared from the public narrative.
That's it. So the Nat Geo bought the right to that story, and they never published it, and we never heard about it. And that's the same with the Sphinx, with the archive room, or I don't know what's beneath the paw, left paw.
The notion of a hall of records under the Sphinx.
Well,
this is an interesting point. And it's one of the things that archaeologists try to do is to present themselves as real scientists.
Yeah, of course.
They want to present themselves as people who weigh stuff, measure stuff, and count stuff.
Right.
They're very materialistic in that sense, and they're extremely suspicious of anything that isn't in that weighing and measuring and counting narrative. And it so happened that there was an American psychic called Edgar Cayce.
Edgar Cayce, exactly. And he said we would find something.
Edgar Cayce made this proposition that from his trance experiences, that the Hall of Records of Atlantis, one of several, not the only one, was hidden beneath the left forepaw of the Sphinx. Well, immediately, such a notion became taboo for archaeologists. They couldn't possibly accept that any truthful information had come through trance experiences.
Even though he said a lot of true things.
He did say a lot of true things, and this stopped any investigation into whether the ancient Egyptians themselves said things like that, and they did. There's no doubt. There's lots of records in ancient Egypt which suggest, first of all, that ancient Egyptian civilization itself is a legacy from an earlier culture. The story of Atlantis is often usually dismissed by archaeologists. I think most people are aware that the earliest surviving reference to Atlantis comes in the works of Plato, and specifically in the dialogues called the Timaeus and the Critias. And archaeologists totally dismiss this. They say that Plato just made the whole thing up because it suited some political or philosophical purpose. No, they don't even accept it as a myth.
Okay, so
they
what's the
accept
purpose?
They regard it as a fiction of Plato's.
What would be the point for Plato to...
Archaeologists have reasons to say that. They say that he wanted to make a political point or a philosophical point about how civilizations can become overproud and overdominant.
And self-destruct.
And self-destruct.
Okay.
But the problem is that this has stopped archaeologists looking for what ancient Egyptian texts say about a lost civilization. And there's really been very important new developments in this area in the last 20 years, and that concerns a body of texts called the Edfu building texts. And they're in the Temple of Horus at Edfu.
I was there, but I missed everything. And then I read your book, and I was like, okay, I need to go back now. You need a guide to understand
Between the inner
on.
and outer enclosure walls, there are huge numbers of texts. And these texts describe a great cataclysm that occurred in the remote past. They describe some object that came down out of the sky and struck what they call the primeval homeland of the gods and split it in two. And it was then engulfed in an enormous flood. And there were few survivors, and those survivors traveled around the world seeking to recreate their civilization, seeking to teach the basics of civilization to other people.
How old is this temple? It's not that old.
This is the problem, you see. The temple is a young temple. It's from the Ptolemaic period, roughly 300 BC.
Okay, it's
so
very young.
2,300 plus years old. However, those texts are not
coming
written
from another.
They're not written in the Egyptian of 2,300 BC. They're written.
Oh, gotcha.
They're written.
In an
Not
older
2,300 BC. Sorry, I must correct myself. The temple is from 300 BC,
yeah.
which means it's 2,300 years
now.
before the present, roughly 2,323 years before
That's
the present,
very
if we want to
precise.
be exact. But the texts are written in Middle Egyptian, and the language of Middle Egyptian is from 2000 BC.
So that means it was probably coming from a past temple.
And they state very clearly that there, and archaeology accepts this, that there were earlier temples on that site. And the archives of those temples were preserved by copying them in hieroglyphs in the language of that time, which would have involved an element of translation, onto the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu. They made a crumbling, deteriorating archive of papyri and material written, they quite specifically state, on animal skins, into a permanent record. And one of the things that's interesting about that, Middle Egyptian we can date back to about 2000 BC. In those texts, they state that this catastrophe that happened to the primeval homeland of the gods happened some 7,000 years before that. That takes us back to 9,000 BC,
Which
more or less.
fits what Edgar Casey said. And
Fits what Edgar Casey said, but it also fits what Plato said.
Right.
Plato said that the destruction of Atlantis occurred, well, it's a complicated story, but Plato seemingly got the story
from an
passed
ancestor.
down from the time of Solon. Solon was the great Greek lawmaker, world famous. It's fully accepted that he made a visit to Egypt round about 600 BC.
And
in that visit, he went to the Temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta, a temple that no longer exists.
Okay.
And he was intrigued by the writings on the walls, and he spoke to priests who also spoke Greek as well as Egyptian. And he asked them, what do these writings say? And they recounted the story that is now found only on the Edfu building text. They recounted the story of a primeval homeland of the gods, which in the process of translation, Solon called Atlantis. It's not an Egyptian word. We're dealing with translations between multiple languages here.
Yeah.
He called it Atlantis. The ancient Egyptians didn't. In the Edfu building text, it's called the primeval homeland of the gods. And it tells the story virtually identical to the story in the Edfu building text about how a great culture is destroyed in a cataclysm and drowned by water, drowned by the ocean. So Solon asks the priests, when did this happen? And they say, 9,000 years ago. In a rather matter-of-fact way, well, that's 600 BC that Solon is there. The priests are saying 9,000 years ago. We have a date. That date is 9,600 BC. In other words, 11,600 or 11,623 years ago from today. Yeah. And that date coincides very precisely with the date that's given in the Edfu building text, 7,000 years plus before Middle Egyptian. In other words, 9,000 plus BC.
So, wow, that's fascinating.
So the second point is that archaeology's attempts to refute Plato's Atlantis story, they want to isolate it from world tradition. They want to say this is just a fiction that
just
was
like
made.
the flood, the great flood in the Bible.
Well,
basically.
this is the point.
Okay.
Atlantis cannot be isolated from global traditions. There is a worldwide tradition of a global cataclysm, which destroyed an advanced civilization of some sort. You find it in India, in southern India, where my wife's family originally come from, in Tamil Nadu. There's told the story of a land called Kumari Kandam, which had a highly sophisticated civilization, where they had great academies, where we were teaching about astronomy, teaching about the shape of the earth. All of this was present in Kumari Kandam, and Kumari Kandam was drowned in a great flood. Guess when? About 11,500 years before our time, the same date that is given in Plato. We have the same story in the Pacific with the lost land of Hiva. We have the story of the biblical flood. That's probably the one that's most familiar to people.
Yeah.
The flood of Noah, but that's preceded in the epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia by an even earlier flood story. They all basically say the same thing, that there was a high civilization of some sort, and that it was destroyed in a global cataclysm.
Well, why can't we take into account these testimonies? Why are we just saying that they are myth or they are...
Because the notion of a lost civilization of the Ice Age, and we're talking about the Ice Age here when we go back before 11,500 years ago, pulls the rug out from under the feet of the whole edifice of archaeology. It's something that archaeologists are most unwilling to accept. And this is where we enter an area which isn't scholarship, it's propaganda. Let's just get rid of Atlantis. Let's just persuade people that Atlantis is a fiction that was made up by Plato. Let's cut him off from the worldwide tradition of a global cataclysm. Let's actually pretend that it has no connection to that tradition. And if we must address that tradition, let's say that was just something that people invented and made up, some kind of story, rather than something that happened. And this is so contrary to reason and contrary to logic, when we know that there were episodes of enormous flooding at the end of the last Ice Age, when we know that sea level rose 120 meters, when we know that enormous areas of the earth were submerged by those rising sea levels.
The Sphinx has water erosion on it.
Well, the water erosion on the Sphinx is a separate issue from rising sea levels.
Is it?
And it's to do...
Oh, because it was heavy rain.
It's to do with rain. The episode called the Younger Dryas, which I and others pinned down as perhaps one of the most important episodes in... Let's use the word loosely, the relatively recent story of the human race. Remember that human beings, anatomically modern human beings, have been around for at least 300,000 years, possibly more than that. The date keeps on getting pushed back.
Officially?
But yes, we have skeletal remains from Morocco, which are anatomically modern humans, and they're 300,000 years old.
It doesn't really work with Darwin's evolution theory.
I don't think it's a problem for. I don't think it's a problem for evolutionary theory.
Okay.
We can talk about evolutionary theory. That's another matter.
That's an interesting one. It's a theory
altogether.
Yeah.
And perhaps we'll come on to that. But before I lose my chain of thought, the plain fact of the matter, and it's a phrase that my kids have embossed on one of my T-shirts, is that stuff keeps on getting older. And by that, what I mean is that the story of anatomically modern humans keeps on getting older. Our species has been around for a very long time, and we now know that there were closely related species such as the Neanderthals, such as the Denisovans, who go back even earlier than 300,000 years ago, who definitely possessed the same symbolic abilities that we did. We're beginning to dispense with the notion of Neanderthals as thuggish, stupid brutes, and we're beginning to realize that they were highly intelligent, sophisticated species. The thing is that as you push the horizons further and further back, you get to a place where there's actually plenty of room for something that we would recognize as a civilization to develop and to be destroyed. You know, it used to be believed, not so long ago, that there had been no anatomically modern humans before about 40,000 years ago. That's a much tighter time frame, but once you push that back to 300,000 years ago, vast expanses of time open up, in which all kinds of things could have happened that aren't yet properly documented.
Yeah.
So I think that archaeology has failed to get to grips with this. I think I've failed to get to grips with the implications of this. And when there are myths or traditions or accounts like the account of Plato, which should require them to think again, they don't think again, they just dismiss them in any possible way. And that's where it becomes propagandistic. basically they're thinking, this is an annoying story which
Yeah.
conflicts with our picture of the past. How can we get rid of it?
We put it on the-
Let's
the
say
carpet.
Plato just made it all up.
Yeah, that's convenient.
It's convenient.
Yeah, but it doesn't satisfy my curiosity, and it doesn't satisfy a lot of people. So I guess that's why we're calling the holes more and more in their narrative, and
Yeah.
that's probably why you're being considered dangerous.
Yeah,
because you're a threat to the narrative, the official narrative.
I'm a threat to the official narrative.
Yeah.
And what archaeologists have tried to do in calling me dangerous and saying that I'm a threat to the official narrative is saying, goodness knows what's going to happen next. If people start questioning
Exactly.
us, they're going to question everything else.
The election,
Yeah,
or
and-
how dangerous is it to question our government? And that's where
Yeah.
I'm like, is it really a bad thing to question and think for yourself? But it seems to be nowadays.
Well,
to-
it should be a positive thing.
Should
It should.
be,
It's
but
a
it's not
fundamental
taught in
human
school.
quality. But it's not. It's some. I mean, as I mentioned, I've been under attack from archaeologists since the mid 1990s.
And yeah, that goes back to the question I had earlier.
And I knew when I presented Ancient Apocalypse, I knew that the series would be attacked by archaeologists because I'd been dealing with it for 30 years.
Exactly, you know what it's like.
I knew that it was coming, and that's why I said in the series that archaeologists regard me as public enemy number one, and they went ahead and proved me right by the way that they.
I
the
think
way
that's
they
a good thing
reacted.
that you address it, because it's like it's on the table and you address it right up from the bat, so we
Yeah.
know.
And I don't want them saying that Hancock claims he's an archaeologist, because I don't.
You don't.
I detest the word pseudo-archaeologist or pseudo-scientist.
Yeah.
This is where let's not underestimate the power of Wikipedia. If people have something they want to find out about, they've heard a little word, they've heard of somebody called Graham Hancock who's saying, maybe there's a lost civilization, maybe there's a forgotten episode. The first place they go is Wikipedia. It's
Yeah.
just easily accessed.
Yeah.
And it's not understood that Wikipedia is not an objective encyclopedia at all. Wikipedia is run by interest groups.
Yeah.
And it happens that the editors who handle my page, who have locked it to the public cannot re-edit my page. If they do attempt to re-edit, the edits are removed immediately.
Yeah.
It happens that the very group of archaeologists who were attacking me in 1995 are the group who run my Wikipedia page. So this cannot be an objective
I didn't
source.
go and read it, but I'm sure it's very
Well,
interesting to read.
the first thing they do is the Graham Hancock promotes pseudo-archaeological
Oh, yeah.
theories. So that's the way that's the language they use to dismiss something that they
Yeah.
don't like. They call it pseudo-archaeological. Now,
Yeah.
the word pseudo, if I understand the etymology correct, means false, false archaeological theories. I don't know how they know that. I don't know what right they have to say that.
Yeah.
I am simply saying that I don't agree with what they say,
Yeah.
and I'm presenting evidence.
In
I've
part.
written a large number of books.
Yeah.
These books are of very great length. Some of them have as many as 2,000 footnotes in them. I reference all my sources very, very carefully. I can't be a pseudo-archaeologist if I don't claim to be an archaeologist.
Exactly.
I claim to be what I am, a writer with
Yeah.
with a background in journalism
Yeah.
who attempts to do very thorough and detailed research.
So do you have other scientists or archaeologists that are backing your theories?
No.
No? Okay.
Not really.
Okay.
There are certain areas.
Yeah.
I've taken a great interest in what's called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis.
Yeah.
The Younger Dryas is a fascinating episode in human prehistory.
It's
We know
1,200 years?
Well, we know that roughly 12,800 years ago, for the 1,000 or 2,000 years before that, the world had been warming up, and there had been a gradual meltdown of the ice sheets. Then suddenly the world went into a very intense cold period. Became extremely cold
Everywhere on the planet.
everywhere on the planet. It was a global phenomenon, and this cold period lasted for about 1,200 years until 11,600 years ago, and then the world very rapidly warmed up again. I mean, let's be clear. The concern about climate change today is nothing, just minuscule by comparison with what happened during the Younger Dryas. Those huge climate shifts from getting warm to getting incredibly cold, from being incredibly cold for 1,200 years and then getting massively warm again suddenly. Nothing like that is happening
suddenly,
today.
like, what are we talking? Like a
We're
human
talking-
lifetime?
we're,
or
we're, we're talking about a human lifetime, yeah. very, very fast.
Okay.
Very, very, very quick.
And could it be a pole shift, or we're not discussing a pole shift here?
I don't know if it was a pole shift. The answer, that's a matter we should pay attention to. And I paid attention to that in my book, Fingerprints of the Gods, in 1995. Yeah. But what happened since 2007 was that a group of real scientists, not journalists,
not
me,
a pseudo-archaeologist,
a group of real sentists began to wonder if there had been a series of impacts from fragments of a disintegrating comet around 12,800 years ago. And they did so on the basis of what is called the Younger Dryas boundary layer. And you can see it exposed in a number of places. Murray Springs in Arizona.
You go there in your series.
I do.
Yeah.
And you can see that it's a layer in the soil which is about the thickness of a human hand. And it's very dark. It's often called the black mat. And it's full of objects, nanodiamonds, melt glass, platinum. It's full of objects that are best explained by an extraterrestrial impact. I don't mean aliens. I mean fundamentally a comet that breaks up into multiple fragments. A lot of the criticism of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has been, where's the crater? But that's not what the hypothesis proposes. It proposes that a very large comet, perhaps as much as 100 kilometers, maybe 200 kilometers in diameter, entered the inner solar system.
It fragmented into
Well, it
smaller
entered
parts?
the inner solar system intact, in their view, around 20,000 years ago.
Wow.
And it went into an orbit that crossed the orbit of the Earth. But because of gravitational forces, this is very common for comets. No scientist would deny this. Comets fragment. They break up into multiple pieces.
Yeah.
And when they do so, instead of having one large object, you have tens of thousands of smaller objects that spread out into a very wide meteor stream. And in the case of what's called the Taurid meteor stream, which is believed to be the culprit in this case, you're looking at a meteor stream that's 30 million kilometers wide. The Earth takes 12 and a half days to pass through it on its orbit, and it passes through the Taurid meteor stream twice a year.
Oh, wow.
And it still does. The suggestion is that 12,800 years ago, some very large fragments in that meteor stream hit the Earth. They didn't, in most cases, actually impact with the surface of the Earth. They were air bursts. They broke up in the atmosphere.
Okay.
And we can have a very recent example of that, which is the Tunguska event in Siberia, which took place on the 30th of June, 1908. That was a fragment, almost certainly out of the Taurid meteor stream, that was no more than 100 meters in diameter. It didn't reach the surface of the Earth. It exploded in the sky. And this is usually what happens with airbursts.
And it still had an impact?
It had a massive impact.
So why does
it flattened 80 million trees across 2,000 square kilometers. It was fortunate for the human race that this was in an uninhabited area of the Earth. But when researchers went there, they found this massive devastation. And if the Tunguska event had happened over a major city, the entire population of that city would have been destroyed.
Yeah.
And what is proposed in the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, there may well have been impacts with the surface of the Earth, but the primary focus of those was on the North American and the Northern European ice caps. Now let's remember that 12,800 years ago, those ice caps were still a couple of kilometers deep. So if you have an object half a kilometer wide that doesn't explode in the atmosphere but hits an ice cap, it's not going to leave a crater in the ground below. It's going to create a crater in the ice cap. And when the ice melts away, that crater will no longer be visible.
So it doesn't leave a trace.
It leaves a trace in the Younger Dryas boundary layer, which is all over the world. It's found in North America, it's found in South America, it's found in Belgium, it's found in as far east as Syria. And somehow it's not
officially accepted?
No, it's accepted that it exists, but it's disputed as to what caused it.
Okay.
And those scientists who proposed the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis have themselves come under a great deal of criticism, and still do, because there are others who are invested in other theories who don't like it. For example, the theory that the great megafauna of the Ice Age, the woolly mammoths, the woolly rhinos, the mastodons, the giant sloths, they all went extinct during the Younger Dryas. They all went extinct between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. There's a huge body of opinion in archaeology that wants to claim that extinction of the megafauna was caused by overhunting by human beings.
We like to put every responsibility on the human
human beings. And therefore, those who are invested in that notion find the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis a threat, because if the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct, then those animals were not made extinct by overhunting. And I can't think of a single hunter-gatherer society in the world today, and some still exist, which overhunt.
Never happens.
They live in harmony with the creatures that they survive upon. They would never wipe them out. And I don't think human beings wiped out the megafauna either. I think the best explanation for the wiping out of the megafauna is this series of impacts of comet fragments all around the world, and the climate change that followed. See, at the moment, it's fully accepted that there was a massive climate change at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, 12,800 years ago, and another massive climate change 11,600 years ago at the end of the Younger Dryas. But the explanation is completely different. They say that the world went into that deep freeze because what's called the global meridional overturning circulation, of which the Gulf Stream is the best known part, was interrupted by meltwater coming off the ice caps, and they accept that as the only necessary explanation. They never ask themselves, why did the meltwater come off the ice caps? Why did it come off in huge quantities suddenly? And that's what the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis answers. It says that these airbursts and impacts on the ice caps caused the shock and the heat generated by those events, caused a sudden melting of the ice. And that ice then flowed into the world ocean and then indeed did cut the Gulf Stream.
Is it the flood we're talking about, or would the flood be later on?
Well, the interesting thing, if you get into the fine details on the Younger Dryas, you will find something very puzzling. That 12,800 years ago, just as the world entered that deep freeze, sea levels rose very rapidly. That shouldn't happen. When the world is going into a freeze, all that excess water should be piled up on the ice caps. It shouldn't be going into the world ocean, and yet it did. It's been absolutely confirmed from Bahamian corals, which can only survive at a few meters under the surface of the sea. They have a very close relationship with the sea, and if the sea gets deeper than 5 meters or so above them, they drown. They can't survive anymore. The drowning of corals 12,800 years ago is clear evidence of a huge rise in sea level at that time. And then when you come to the end of the Younger Dryas, 11,600 years ago, you have this massive warming that takes place. And you have another flood then, and that's called Meltwater Pulse 1b. And that 11,600 years ago date is the date that coincides with Plato's story of Atlantis. That's when he says Atlantis went under 9,000 years before the time of Solon, 11,600 years before our time. It's the date that coincides with the date given in the Edfu building texts. And the question is, what caused that sudden warming? And on this, there is much less work being done than on the problem of the beginning of the Younger Dryas. I go back to the work of Sir Fred Hoyle, who was a great astronomer, passed away now, who long ago was looking at this problem, and he suggested that the sudden warming at the end of the Younger Dryas was caused by a comet impact, not impacting an ice cap, not air bursting, but hitting an ocean, hitting a major ocean, sending up a huge cloud of water vapor into the upper atmosphere, creating a massive instant global warming effect and resulting in this sudden rise in sea level and sudden rise in global temperatures. It's interesting because he suggested that long before the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis was ever proposed. It seemed to him the best explanation.
It's matching the theory.
Well, it does. It matches the theory, because you would expect with a meteor stream, and I repeat that what is called the torrid meteor stream, which we presently pass through at the end of June and at the end of October, we pass through it twice a year, that we would expect to have not just one episode of impacts, we'd expect to have multiple episodes of impact. Just like the Tunguska event in 1908 is also from an object that I believe, fell out of the Torrid meteor stream, because the 30th of June 1908 coincides with the peak of what is called the beta Taurids. They are the most likely culprit for that. We are in a relationship with this meteor stream, and that relationship isn't just 12,800 years old. It's a relationship that still continues today. There are very large objects still in the Torrid meteor stream, some of which are fully recognized by mainstream astronomers. The best known is called Comet Encke.
Yeah, I heard about
And
that.
Comet Encke is about 6 kilometers in diameter. That's an Earth killer.
Yeah.
You get something like that, hits the Earth intact, and it's going to
We're gone.
we're pretty much gone. We're the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
We cross the orbit of the Torrid meteor stream. Now, fortunately, it's 30 million kilometers wide. There are multiple filaments of debris, and we haven't in recent past hit a very large object, but the possibility is always there that we will, and some calculations suggest that we might do so within the next 30 or 40 years.
Well, I have a question.
I want to say something very clearly. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis provides an answer to my mystery of a lost civilization of the Ice Age. You don't lose a civilization without some kind of cataclysmic event taking place. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't suddenly disappear from the world without a great cataclysm occurring. And the best evidence for a massive cataclysm 12,800 years ago, which is around the date that I've always been proposing, even before I knew about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, is that we have that cataclysm with the initiation, with the onset of the Younger Dryas. And I want to be clear that the scientists who have evolved the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, they're not interested in whether or not there was a lost civilization. That's not their thing.
Yeah.
They are simply saying that there was a gigantic global cataclysm 12,800 years ago.
Yeah.
It was a long-term event. It lasted for 1,200 years, and it saw the extinction of all the megafauna all around the world, and obviously had a huge impact on human populations. But they don't go the next step, which I go, and say that one of those human populations, perhaps several of them, were at a much more sophisticated level of development than archaeologists attribute to the peoples of the Ice Age. That's my idea.
But how did they... Okay, so we were talking about the Sphinx, and I'd like to go back to the Sphinx because you're talking about the rain water, and I'm wondering, in your opinion, why was it built, and was it built before they got wiped out? 'Cause I can't imagine, like, let's put ourselves back 12,000 years ago, and if we're experiencing something like that, I guess we're not in a position to go and build a Sphinx. Like, you have to be...
The evidence suggests the Sphinx was already there 12,800 years ago. It was a monument that existed before the Younger Dryas, and that in the case of the Sahara Desert, and the place where the Sphinx sits is part of the Sahara Desert. Yeah. In the case of the Sahara Desert, what happened 12,800 years ago, just as other parts of the world went into a deep freeze, further south there was heavy rain. There were thousand years, actually, more than 1,000 years of extremely heavy rain on the Sahara Desert during the Younger Dryas.
And we know that for a fact?
Yes, we know that for a fact.
Okay.
There's no doubt about it.
Nobody questions that.
Nobody questions that.
Okay.
But what they do question is what's called the precipitation-induced weathering on the Sphinx. And I want to pay tribute here to the work of Professor of Geology Robert Schoch, Professor of Geology at Boston University, who was introduced to the Sphinx by the late, great John Anthony West, who was a dear friend of mine. John had always felt that the Sphinx was much older than mainstream archaeology accepts.
What's the official date for
Officially,
the
the Sphinx is supposed to be about 2,500 BC, in other words, 4,500 years ago. Yeah. But the evidence of that it was exposed to about 1,000 years of heavy rainfall means that it must be much older than that, because there was no such rainfall in Egypt 4,500 years ago, and you have to go back to the Younger Dryas to find that humid, wet period.
So that would mean that there were humans living, like the civilization was still there during this rain.
Yeah, it would mean that it was there before the rain. Before the Younger Dryas, the Sphinx already stood there. Now, when archaeologists criticize the notion that the Sphinx is older, this used to be the standard response when I and my colleagues argued that the Sphinx is much older than 4,500 years old, they would say, no, that's impossible. The Sphinx is the work of an advanced civilization. There could be, we would find hundreds of monuments like that all around the world if a civilization of that sort existed. So obviously the Sphinx just dates to 4,500 years ago. There was a famous quotation from the American archaeologist Mark Lehner, who said, just show me a single potsherd from that period. Well, the thing is that they've not revised that position since the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is a gigantic megalithic site. It's highly sophisticated. If you can create Göbekli Tepe, you can create the Sphinx. And Göbekli Tepe dates to 11,600 years ago, the end of the Younger Dryas.
How do we know that for sure?
We know that for sure from carbon dating. Carbon dating is often a very suspect dating method. Why? Because you can't date stone. There is no technique to date stone, particularly if that stone has been exposed to the atmosphere for a very long time. What carbon dating does is it dates organic material that is associated with the stone. Now, the problem with that is that in many archaeological sites, the great temples of Malta are an example. Carbon dating is not reliable because those structures have been open to the world for a very long time. Many different cultures have been there, have been through them, and have left their mark upon them. And it's very difficult to say where this piece of organic material, when that piece of organic material was deposited, may not be the time that the monuments were created. It may be quite a different time.
Right.
You know, what you really want, and as far as I'm aware, this has not been found anywhere on, for example, Malta. What you want is a piece of organic material that you can carbon date, which is trapped underneath a giant megalith. And then you can begin to make the assumption that the megalith was put there according to the date of that organic material. But this is impossible in the case of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is carved out of solid rock. And it cannot be carbon dated. And no Egyptologist will claim that they've carbon dated the Sphinx. They attribute the date to the Sphinx based entirely on context. And that context is suspect. They say that the pyramids date to about 4,500 years ago. The Sphinx is part of the pyramid complex, therefore everything is 4,500 years old. Well, that's all supposition. It's not fact.
And it's the official story, and it's set in stone.
It's set in stone.
No one questions that.
Nobody's supposed to question it. It's kind of heresy. This is where archaeology functions, and a lot of science today functions this way, like a religion, that everybody's just supposed to accept what scientists say.
I can't accept this official narrative because to me it's very obvious that it's flawed. It doesn't make sense to me, and I think I'm just applying critical thinking here. It's very obvious to me that no one could build this pyramid. I think it's 100 years that the official
the Great Pyramid of Giza is supposed to be built in 23 years.
They don't even build like a triplex in Montreal in 20 years, so I can't see how
it's a fair point. And the Great Pyramid is one of the most gigantic and complex monuments that exists anywhere in the world. My wife Santha and I have climbed the Great Pyramid 5 times.
Why?
Why?
Why did you want to climb the pyramid?
What a joy. Weren't you afraid to trip or just like kill yourself? Or somebody's killed every year falling off the Great Pyramid. It could have been you, Graham. Could have been. Okay. That's one of the reasons why the Egyptian government has now made it a criminal offense to climb the Great Pyramid. Did you? Are you banned in Egypt? I am presently banned in Egypt. Is that because of your climbing? No, it's because my point of view disagrees with the point of view of Egyptology. This bothers them more than the fact that you climbed the pyramid. Yeah. The basic issue is Atlantis. Egyptologists hate the idea of Atlantis. You don't really talk much about Atlantis, do you? I don't feel like you talk that much about it. I don't talk about it more than I talk about any other flood myth from all around the world. But this one it's a crime. It raises particular hostility amongst archaeologists, and they say, so you're suggesting ancient Egyptian civilization didn't have its own unique origin. They actually were influenced by somebody outside. So it excites sort of nationalistic feelings as well. But I don't know any single human culture that hasn't been influenced by other cultures. That's part of being human. Yeah, exactly. We learn stuff from other people. We share. We pass on our knowledge. We receive their knowledge. That's how things work. Why should Egypt be any different? Why should any culture in the ancient world? So you were going to say you climbed the pyramid 5 times? Yes, and on one of those climbs, and it was particularly noticeable. It was on what is called the Eid, the holiday that immediately follows the end of Ramadan, where people have been fasting for a month. And tens of thousands of Cairenes were out on the Giza Plateau having picnics. And some of them, hundreds of them, decided, we're going to climb the pyramid. And Santha and I joined them.
You did?
We climbed the pyramid with them.
And
that's our previous climbs and subsequent climbs had been on our own.
Yeah.
But that climb, we were accompanied by hundreds and hundreds of people from Cairo who
Didn't
were all...
feel like you were like transgressing some sacred monument or some sort?
I don't regard it that way.
No?
I think the Great Pyramid invites us to transgress it. It's there posing a huge question. It's saying, figure me out.
Yeah, that's really
Figure
what
me
they're
out.
saying.
I am standing here. I am almost perfectly oriented to true north. My scale and dimensions coincide, provide a code for the scale and dimensions of the Earth, and that scale is of 1 to 43,200, which is not a random...
A very important number.
It's a very important number. It's not a random number at all. Height of the Great Pyramid, the real height, 481 feet. I can't
How do you
immediately translate that
remember
into meters.
that?
The Great Pyramid is a bit shorter now because it doesn't have its capstone.
Yeah, but they're almost the same size.
But if you measure the Great Pyramid today, there's a flat platform
Yeah.
on top of it, and that's about 450 feet above ground level. But it was originally 481 feet tall, and you can tell that just by continuing the angle of
Yep.
the pyramid up to the top. That figure multiplied by 43,200 gives you the polar radius of the Earth. And the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid multiplied by the same number gives you the equatorial circumference of the Earth. And I don't think that's random. I think that's genuine. And I think it is there to pose a huge question about our past. I think the pyramid was designed to make people think. And it was created by people who thought very carefully. And they weren't just making a tomb for a pharaoh. They were doing something much more important than that. They were creating a permanent message.
But I'm still
to the future.
scratching my head. Why did they make it so complicated so we don't even get it? Like it's
Well, we can begin to get it if we open our eyes and if we listen to what the pyramid has to say. If we listen to what it has to say, that almost perfect alignment to true north, and I say 3/60ths of a single degree off true north because a degree in astronomy is divided into 60 minutes. 3/60ths of a single degree off true north is a tiny error.
yeah.
It's an error, but it's a very tiny error.
Can you give us like an example of what does it represent? Like
Well,
in our
With
our technology today, would we be able to be more precise than
Could
that?
we do that? Yes. Would we do that? No. What's the point? What's the point of going? You're already creating a monument that's almost impossible to build, which consists of 6 million tons of stone, which has a footprint of more than 13 acres, which is 481 feet high. You're creating this. You're creating something that's difficult anyway. It's not easy to build a pyramid. A lot of archaeologists suggest it's easy. It's not. You make a mistake at ground level, and by the time you get to the summit, you've got a corkscrew, not a pyramid. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
So great attention was paid to the creation of this structure.
And the relation with the sky as well. With
Well, if you listen to the pyramid, first of all, that tiny error, that tiny human error, tells us that this was a culture that paid attention to astronomy. You can't get that level of accuracy without using astronomy. You can't just figure out what true north, and forget about compasses.
Yeah.
Compasses do not give us true north or south or east or west. They give us magnetic north, which can be as much as 11 degrees off true north.
Yeah.
They're a rough guide to where north is, but they're not an accurate. If you want accuracy, you've got to use the stars.
Yeah.
And so, first of all, the Great Pyramid is saying to us, we use the stars. It says it to us in a number of ways. There are 4 narrow shafts that are cut through the body of the Great Pyramid. 2 of them emanate from the so-called King's Chamber, which is the highest of the 3 great chambers in the Great Pyramid, and they do exit on the outside of the body of the pyramid. 2 of them...
And we don't know what they're for.
Well, I think we do know what they're for.
Do?
Again, if you listen to the pyramid.
They're pointing at...
They're pointing at specific stars.
Yeah.
And this is one of the enigmas of the Great Pyramid. Let me be clear. 2 shafts running from the King's Chamber right to the outside of the Great Pyramid. We know that they run all the way through the pyramid because in Victorian times, people would roll cannonballs down them. And those cannonballs would end up in the King's Chamber. They would climb up the outside, roll a metal cannonball down them, and lo and behold, they turned up in the king's chamber. So they definitely are from the king's chamber and they exit
Yeah.
on the outside. The ones in the queen's chamber do not exit on the outside of the Great Pyramid. And until 1872, they weren't apparent on the inside of the queen's chamber either. It took a curious person to...
The one who used dynamite in the...
No, that's Howard Weiss.
Yeah.
He was another one.
Yeah.
This one was actually a British Freemason who was interested in the fact that there were shafts in the king's chamber, and he went around knocking on the walls of the queen's chamber, and he found 2 hollow points, and he cut those out because you could do that in the 1870s. He cut those out, and lo and behold, they open into shafts, and those shafts are about this high and this wide, and they go horizontal for some distance, and then they rise up at an angle. And that angle, the angle of all 4 shafts, points at key stars, and this is where it becomes puzzling, because those key stars are in the position that they were in 2500
exactly.
BC.
That's why I was puzzled with your book.
They're in the position that they were in 2500 BC. And this
how's
is
that
why
possible?
I would never divorce the ancient Egyptians from the completion of the pyramid project, because the other aspect of it is the pattern of the 3 pyramids on the ground. And once you accept, as I do, the notion that the 3 great pyramids replicate the pattern of the 3 stars of the belt of the constellation of Orion, and take into account the phenomenon known as precession, which is a wobble on the axis of the Earth that changes, from our viewpoint, the positions of the stars as they appear in the sky. Once you take that into account, you're looking at the shape of Orion's belt on the ground as it was 12,500 years ago. So weirdly, we have a ground layout which speaks to 12,500 years ago, very close to 12,800 years ago. And then we're looking at shafts which point to 2,500 BC, 4,500
So
years
the
ago.
shafts could have been added later on.
I think so. I think we have to take the ancient Egyptians seriously. They say that their knowledge was a legacy from what they call the first time, from Zep Tepi. And I would not say that the ancient Egyptians did not build the pyramids. I think they were closely involved in the construction of the pyramids, and I think they used preserved knowledge that had been passed down from thousands of years before. They were completing a project that had been begun thousands of years earlier. So if I envisage the Giza Plateau 12,500 years ago, what I see there are 3 relatively low megalithic platforms laid out in exactly the pattern, because the pyramids were then built on top of them. The Great Pyramid itself is built...
That's where I guess I'm skeptical, because I guess in my perception of today, I can't imagine starting a project thinking, oh, they're going to finish it in 8,000 years. Like it seems impossible to me. And it's such a major project that I would feel that when you start doing this project, you start in the idea that you're going to finish it. So when I was reading your book, I was trying to keep an open mind, but it seemed to me that that's where I feel like I can't really wrap my mind around it. It seems that this project is so huge, so wide, that it had to be made in an idea. And how can they be sure that thousands of years later, we would, like the Egyptians would take their legacy and finish what they had started, if they were trying to give us a message or something?
It's a fair point. But to me, the answer to that is simple. We have such things as secret societies. We have such things as the transmission of knowledge over thousands and thousands of years. I mean, nobody would dispute that the origins of the Old Testament in the Bible go back 4,000 years, and there's a continuity from then right through until today. Ideas are passed down, they're transmitted. I'm only suggesting that it was the same in ancient Egypt.
You think it was, so that would be sort of the same story with Plato, saying that he received this story from his 600 years ancestor that lived 600 years before him.
Yeah, who was being told a story that was even older.
Never. And that's why I need to put myself in this mindset that they probably respected the past way more than we do now.
Look,
And
I'm gonna go out on a limb here and tell you what I think happened. I think there was a lost civilization of the Ice Age. I think there were survivors. I think they did attempt to reinitiate civilization, but they weren't quite able to do so. They created, if you like, secret societies all around the world, which persisted for thousands of years, initiates to whom knowledge was passed down, waiting for the right moment to switch civilization back on again. If your project is to reinitiate civilization and you discover that you can't do it at a particular time. The world during the Younger Dryas was a very complicated
So
and
you
difficult
assume
place.
that people lived during that period of time?
Oh, yes. People definitely lived, and we know they did.
Survived.
There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, all around the world.
But what I'm suggesting is that the project was put on hold for thousands of years. And it's very odd how all around the world, roughly 5,000 to 4,500 years ago, civilizations pop up everywhere.
Yeah.
Consider the pyramids of Caral in Peru, about 5,000 years old. Consider the Giza project and the whole beginning of the first dynasty in Egypt. About 5,000 years ago, the first dynasty begins. Consider Mesopotamia, roughly 5,000 years ago. It all switches on all at once,
which
all
is
over
a
the world.
mystery as well.
It's a mystery in
How
itself.
can you start there being already so knowledgeable that you're able to build the Great Pyramids? Like, oh, the first thing I build and it's perfect.
Yeah, it's a very odd thing, and I'm suggesting that there was a body of preserved knowledge, and the notion of a hall of records of Atlantis under the Great Sphinx
And yeah, we're
might
coming
be a
back to
part of that. That knowledge was deliberately preserved, and that if you like, secret society, that group of initiates who passed the knowledge down from generation to generation, they
That
would
makes
select
sense.
the brightest and the
The
best.
priests in Egypt.
They would
have
select
had-
the brightest and the best from the local population,
Right.
and they would initiate them into their system of knowledge.
That makes sense.
And gradually, a time would come where it made sense to switch civilization on again. And I think that's what happened in ancient
Was there,
Egypt.
you think, a shift in energy, or do you think there was like some kind of a paradigm shift where they felt like? How do you explain that suddenly they built the pyramids, or they built very huge monuments?
I don't see how the Great Pyramid could have been built without an inheritance of knowledge.
Yeah.
As you say, you would expect the first thing that's built to be relatively primitive.
Yeah.
You would expect to see signs of evolution
Yeah.
ahead of the Great
It's like
Pyramid.
my baby's drawing, and her drawings are not very good, but she's improving,
Yeah,
as she
improving.
draws, and it seems
That's
to
what
be how
that's
we
what
work.
we normally expect, but that's not what we see in Egypt.
No.
We see the best being the oldest, and we see then a decline. The pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties are very poor
Yeah.
by comparison with the pyramids
They
that are
didn't.
attributed
When
to the
you
4th
go, they
dynasty.
just look like
Look like crumbling hills,
exactly,
little
yeah.
crumbling hills.
Yeah.
The Pyramid of Unas, for example, which has fantastic texts written inside it.
but it's falling apart.
It's falling apart. It's a very poor work of construction by comparison. And yet the Great Pyramid and its two companions are perfect.
They are.
almost perfect. And
Yeah.
and I would say that we are looking at the application of a much more ancient system of knowledge there. That's the best way I can explain
Yeah.
the enigma to myself. The
Right.
enigma of star alignments that speak to two epochs, that speak to 4,500 years before our time, and that speaks to 12,500 years before our time.
So what about the Sphinx and the archive room underneath its paw? So his name is Schock, the geologist
Schock,
that
yeah.
worked on it. He's the one who discovered it. Am I correct? No.
No. I think we have to give that credit to John Anthony West, and even before him to a scholar called Schwaller de Lubix.
So they use like a technology, like radar, sonar
No,
technology? or-
initially it was just a perception. Schwaller de Lubix looked at the Sphinx back in the 1920s, 1930s, and he just made a passing remark that it looks like this Sphinx has been subject to some kind of water erosion. And then John Anthony West, who was a dear friend of ours, who passed away in 2018, John Anthony West took that further, and he began to examine the Sphinx closely and looking at the erosion patterns on it and trying to explain them to himself. And then he got in touch with Robert Schock at Boston University, who is an accredited geologist, and he asked him to come to Egypt, and Schock then made a close study of the Great Sphinx, which involved much more than just looking at it. It involved seismic work as well, which identified a chamber under the left forepaw of the Sphinx.
That's what happened.
And he came to the conclusion that the weathering patterns on the Sphinx were caused by exposure to more than 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And then we have to invoke the science of paleoclimatology. When was there last a period of heavy rainfall in that part of the Sahara Desert?
Yeah.
Answer, the Younger Dryas, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. So from his point of view, the Sphinx was weathered by heavy rains during that period, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, doesn't mean that that's when the Sphinx was built.
No.
The word built is wrong. The Sphinx was carved out of solid bedrock.
Yeah.
It wasn't built at all.
But they added some rocks and
well, those are all let me be clear. I'm going to speak of myself and my colleagues here. Professor Robert Schock, John Anthony West, very important Robert Boval, who's done the most important and significant work on the astronomy of ancient Egypt. Well, Robert
co-wrote a book.
Robert and I wrote a book together. Robert is actually Belgian, but he was born in Egypt.
I thought his accent was Belgian. I was trying to figure out what was
his accent. His soul is Egyptian, for sure. That's his true culture, and he is a brilliant archaeoastronomer. He's done a great deal of astronomy work. There's nobody who matches him in this field. We're all of the view that the Great Sphinx, and I'd like to mention another more recent researcher, Manu Seifzadeh, who has done a great deal. He is fluent in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Wow.
He's also fluent in the German language. This is important because the Edfu building texts that I mentioned earlier were partially translated when I first worked on them, but they've now been completely translated into German. And that complete translation absolutely vindicates the notion that the Edfu building texts are telling the same story as the story of Atlantis. And it's only gradually filtering out into the outside world because it's in German and needs to be translated into more widely spoken languages in order to get there. All of us are of the view that the Great Sphinx was originally not only a lion-bodied monument, but also a lion-headed monument. It was a lion. It was a huge lion. The Great Sphinx is oriented perfectly due east, and therefore it looks at the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the equinox, on the spring equinox, 21st of March, and on the autumn equinox, 21st of September. Now we get into complicated areas here, but if you go to astrology, which again archaeologists will dismiss as complete nonsense, if you go to astrology, we live presently in the age of Pisces. Why? Because the constellation that rises behind the sun on the spring equinox is the constellation of Pisces in our age. But the old song has it right. We live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And within about 100 or 150 years, this precessional wobble of the Earth is the viewing platform from which we observe the stars. If it's wobbling on its axis, it's going to change the positions of the stars as we perceive them in the sky. And most importantly, it's going to change the pole star. Presently, our pole star is Polaris, but as that axis does this over a cycle of 26,000 years, other stars have been the pole star, and other stars will be the pole star in the future, and sometimes no star will occupy the area of space to which the pole of the Earth points. It will also affect the constellations of the zodiac that rise behind the sun at key moments of the year, the spring equinox, the autumn equinox, and the two solstices. And we live in the age of Pisces because it's the constellation of Pisces that presently houses the sun in our age. Before us, it was the constellation of Aries. It's not an accident that during the age of Aries, the ancient Egyptians' symbology was all about rams.
Yeah, they're
Before that, it was the age of Taurus. Taurus housed the sun on the spring equinox.
Again, this Karnak that you get all the.
Well, you have the ram-headed sphinxes in Karnak, which are built during the age of Aries. It's not an accident that the early Christians used the fish as their symbol because they were in the time of the age of Pisces. And the bottom line to all of this is that in that epoch of 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, that cataclysmic epoch that we now call the Younger Dryas, the constellation that housed the sun on the spring equinox was the constellation of Leo. So
that would be enough to convince anyone.
It doesn't convince archaeologists, but when you combine the two sciences, when you combine astronomy and realize that 12,500, 12,800 years ago, the Sphinx was gazing directly at its own celestial counterpart at dawn on the spring equinox. When you combine that with the geology that says that in exactly that period there was enormous rainfall that caused the erosion on the body of the Sphinx, then we have a much more effective method of dating the Sphinx than any kind of carbon dating, which we can't do on the body of the Great Sphinx. We have geology and we have astronomy, and both sciences coincide on dating the Sphinx to more than 12,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And it may well be much more than 12,000 years ago. It could go back to the previous.
Which would be 36,000
Which would be 36,000 years
That's
ago.
way too far for a lot of people, I think, here.
And even for me, I think
Yeah.
that the Sphinx is best tied to the epoch of about 12,500 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was a lion-bodied monument. Then came this heavy rainfall. It destroyed that leonine head. It became heavily eroded and damaged. And in the time of the ancient Egyptians, who saw themselves as the successor of an earlier culture, who were completely open and honest about that, who said they received all their knowledge from the gods. Who saw themselves as the heirs, as the recipients of a legacy from that time, they saw the very damaged head of the leonine head of the Sphinx, and they recarved it into a human head, wearing the classic Nemes headdress of an Egyptian pharaoh. Egyptologists say that proves the Sphinx was built by the ancient Egyptians. No, I don't think so.
The head is smaller than the rest of the
body. The
body.
head is much smaller than the rest of the body.
Yeah.
It's completely out of proportion. It's a restoration project on a very damaged, very ancient sculpture. A sculpture on an enormous scale that we now know as the Great Sphinx.
To look at it, and it's obvious that the head was carved and afterwards because it's much smaller. But
and the ancient Egyptians were masters of proportion.
Yes,
if they'd had
they
a
were.
choice, they would not have done that. But they didn't have a choice. They had this very damaged head.
And they did something, whatever they could to...
But what they couldn't do is change the orientation of the Sphinx.
Yeah.
And it will always gaze at the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox. My wife and I have been there many times at dawn on the spring equinox. And you can see that the Great Sphinx looks directly at the rising sun at that day. You go there on the summer solstice, it's many degrees to the north of east. You go there on the winter solstice, it's many degrees to the south of east. We've been there at every occasion, but at the equinox, perfectly looks at the rising sun and therefore looks at the constellation that houses the sun. And that speaks to the age of Leo. That speaks to 12,000 plus years ago.
Right. And now I want to get to this under spa, like there's this cavity. And the government never authorized any research for that, I'm aware.
Yeah, I kind of avoid conspiracy theories.
I know you do.
But...
Listen, there are conspiracies
in
the world.
Yeah, there are conspiracies.
Yeah.
Robert Schoch and his team did seismic work, quite simple seismic work, where you use a hammer and bash it on the ground and see how the sound waves reflect under the surface of the bedrock.
Yeah.
And what those sound waves showed was a large, regular-shaped chamber, about 20 or 30 feet under the left forepaw of the Great Sphinx.
And that was like 20 years ago, 30
Oh, that
years
was 1992.
So the technology we have nowadays would be much
We could do
accurate,
much more.
But we don't.
Well, oddly enough, the two leading Egyptologists, the leading Egyptian Egyptologist, Dr. Zahi Hawass, and the leading American Egyptologist, Dr. Mark Lehner, have been involved in drilling around the Sphinx. And they claim that drilling has been entirely to clear groundwater from beneath the Sphinx. But it's very odd that their drills went in very, very close to the place where that chamber is.
That drives me insane. Like I get really, really mad.
Me too, because this is a matter that could be put to rest relatively easily. If there were openness, if there were transparency, if there were no secrets, it would be possible to do ground penetrating radar. It would be possible to do seismic tomography with the latest equipment and to absolutely settle it, whether there's a large chamber under the Sphinx or not. Instead, Egyptology has chosen simply not to talk about this.
Not to talk about it, but I'm pretty sure they did do something about it. But they keep...
I can't help having that feeling.
Well, of course, that's how the world is. You were talking about secret societies, and the knowledge has been passed to a very tiny elite throughout the years. And I understand that some...
And there's another odd thing, which I've mentioned before, and I'll mention it again, is that both Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass received their college education courtesy of the Edgar Cayce Foundation.
What?
Robert and I documented it at length in our book, Keeper of Genesis, which is called The Message of the Sphinx in America. Well, it is possible because the Edgar Cayce Foundation, because of Edgar Cayce's statements, was very interested in the Sphinx.
Yeah, very much.
And what they did was they found two young men who were working around the Sphinx. Zahi Hawass, then not Dr. Zahi Hawass, was a simple inspector on the Giza Plateau. And they found the funding to send him through university.
What does that mean?
I'm not sure what it means. I'm just stating a fact.
Let's speculate.
And the same goes with Mark Lehner, who was also sent through university by the Edgar Cayce Foundation. And since then, both of them have completely distanced themselves from the Edgar Cayce Foundation.
Oh, okay.
Now you have to wonder how sincere that distancing is. Zahi Hawass, until very recently, was still giving lectures to the Edgar Cayce Foundation, even though he claims to detest the whole notion of Atlantis. You just have to wonder. I can't help wondering.
I'm confused here. Very confused.
I'm confused too.
I don't understand, because I feel like Edgar Cayce is the one that brought this myth to life in the last century.
Yeah.
I read a lot of his books. Well, not his personal books, but a lot of his readings, and he kept saying that we would discover this chamber, and I feel like betrayed or very disappointed that it's not coming. And if we did discover it, I feel even more frustrated that we don't share this knowledge with the whole humanity. I feel like this belongs to me and you and everyone, and if it does, changes,
this whole mess needs to be unraveled. And it is a mess at the moment. There are so many conflicting interests involved in it. There's the interests of mainstream archaeology, which both Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner claim to represent and do represent. They are fully accredited Egyptologists now.
But they work for the government, do they?
Well, no. Mark Lehner works for the University of Chicago.
Oh, okay.
And Zahi Hawass was the chief inspector of antiquities on the Giza Plateau. He became a minister of culture briefly.
Yeah, okay, he's the one I thought. Yeah.
He's
very high place in the government.
Very highly placed.
Well,
there were some scandals surrounding his name, and he faced a criminal charge, which was then dropped.
Okay.
And he no longer has a high government position.
Okay.
But he's still the Egyptologist to whom the government refers.
I don't want this guy to be in charge of the biggest discovery of the last century.
Nor do I.
I don't feel okay with that. And why then is it unraveling this way? And I heard you say in an interview, you felt like that there was sort of a shift, like we need to know, and there is something at work in the world that makes us. I listen. You said it way better than I do, and I feel the opposite. Like I feel throughout our history, the known history of humanity, we forget. Like when you say in your book, the conquistadors, when they got in Americas, they destroyed everything, and the Alexandria Library. And, it's happened so often in our past that we destroyed our knowledge,
we destroy our own past all the time.
I feel
the destruction of the Mayan codices in Central America.
It's like in our DNA.
We deliberately destroy our own memory.
Everything.
It's a very peculiar phenomenon.
There's like a handful left of everything that was there, and it would have changed everything.
But the plain fact of the matter is that the Sphinx issue could be relatively easily solved with modern technology.
So
is
why
there
don't
or
we
is
do
there
it?
not a chamber beneath the Great Sphinx? Robert Schoch's seismic work back in 1992 says yes, there is a chamber underneath the Great Sphinx. Now
31 years later.
We've got much better technology today, and it could be relatively easily solved, but nobody is solving it. And I wonder why. And then I look at the connection, the very definite connection between Zahi Hawass and the Edgar Cayce organization, between Mark Lehner and the Edgar Cayce organization. These are the two most powerful archaeologists working around the Great Sphinx. And I can't help wondering whether there's something going on that we're not being told about. I don't claim that's a fact. I'm just puzzled.
Of course, we're wondering, because I would think that Edgar Cayce would have, the foundation would have funded anything that would have proven.
I suspect that they did. To some extent, but then we have to ask ourselves, when do they want this information to be released? Is there a particular moment?
I guess it's just very inconvenient for them, because
Cayce made some statements about, and I don't remember the exact details about when this information would return to the world. And maybe there's an agenda at work here. Maybe in 5 or 10 or 15 years, the truth will out.
I never thought at this age I am right now that we wouldn't know. Like I feel like I expected that to happen before, so I'm
yes,
disappointed.
I expect it to happen as well.
There's so much secrecy
and
in our world.
if you're drilling around the Great Sphinx, identifying groundwater and drawing up groundwater from under the Sphinx, you're already there. You have everything you need to put this matter to rest, and either say, yeah, definitely there's no chamber, or yes, definitely there is a chamber.
I think we're past this question. It's like, what's in there?
That's the next.
That's
thing.
the big question.
Or indeed, if there is anything in there, has it been already removed?
And that's where I get anxious. I don't even want to think about it.
Yeah.
There's
too much secrecy,
everything.
and it's unnecessary. This is a global human heritage. Yes, it's in ancient Egypt. Yes, it belongs first and foremost to the Egyptian people, but
it
is
everyone.
a global heresy, a global legacy. It belongs to everybody in the world. We all have the same need to know the truth about our past. And the Great Sphinx is a very important structure in connection with that.
Yeah.
And resolving this issue would be relatively straightforward, and it's a puzzle to me. And as I say, I don't like conspiracy theories, but I have to feel there's some kind of conspiracy going on.
We know when we're being lied to.
Either a conspiracy of ignorance,
yeah,
which is so locked in a particular framework that we don't want to know, or some sort of deliberate project.
Well, and that's why I think also it creates a lot of skepticism, because we see that we are being deceived or lied to or just kept in the dark on so many topics.
Yeah. There's a great deal of distrust now, and this is a healthy thing. That humans have begun to distrust our governments. We don't trust them. And we go back to the 1950s, and by and large, people did trust their governments. That's changed, and it's changed because of facts. Because we've all learnt that our governments lie to us, that they mislead us, that they
19% of people in Quebec got vaccinated, so I guess they still do trust the government a lot. But so but there was a lot of fear factor, and that's
what I've seen happening gradually over the last 20 years is a growing distrust of authority.
Right.
And I regard that as a very healthy process.
Yeah.
It's not complete yet. Authority is still very much in control and very much in control of central narratives about what human beings are and what we're here to do. The central narrative of Western technological culture is that human beings are primarily here to produce and to consume. And really everything else is secondary. Yeah. The religious powers say that we're primarily here to serve God, but both the religious powers and the secular powers are imposing a narrative on the population, and gradually, bit by bit, people are fighting back.
Have you always been an anarchist and at heart?
Well, let's look at the word anarchy. It means literally without government.
Exactly.
And yes, I would regard myself as an anarchist. I don't think that governments are nearly as necessary as they claim to be.
Yeah,
I think there is a case in large, complicated societies for some sort of administration to be involved. But governments which tell us what to do, which tell us what to think, which tell us what's important and what's not important and expect us to buy into that, they're the cause of most of the troubles in the world today. I would say the big governments, big centralized governments, and the big centralized religions and the big centralized corporations, these are the three branches of most of the horror and evil that takes place in the world today.
Yeah.
And they look after their own interests.
Of course.
And they pretend that they're doing so in our interests.
The greater good. It doesn't feel like it.
We need to see through that. And it's just a question whether that structure will be dismantled in time before it actually destroys the human race completely.
I think something will happen before. I think a lot of people are waking up. The more they are controlling us and smothering us, the more we need air, and then we break free from this. I really believe. I talk about the COVID because I've had a lot of people writing to me, people who are following me, who wrote to me to say it felt good to see during the pandemic that some people were a counter narrative like I was, but also a lot of people said it was so intense what happened, what we witnessed, like having a hot dog to get a shot, or people were like, lots of people woke up. Lots of people said this was not about health anymore. Why would I get a hot dog? I mean, it's not even healthy food. So if it's really about health.
You mean people were being rewarded with a hot dog if they had the shot?
Yes, that's what we had that in Quebec. Yes. And they were trying to get the youth to go, and so they would have this incentive, very stupid incentive. And in the States, they were even more stupid than that.
Well, consider the other thing, which is if you wanted to travel.
Most people got jabbed before.
If you wanted to travel during the COVID period, you had to have a shot. It was literally impossible
you just don't travel.
to go from one country to another. Well, some of us have to travel for our work.
I get it. I do. That's why I say that. We do travel shows, my husband and I, but we had babies, so it was easy to say we were not going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, then that's another.
There was a whole system. Part of it was propaganda, and part of it was structure, like the fact that you can't travel for your work unless you have a shot.
Yeah.
Which forced people into accepting what the government said.
And you mentioned that was for work, like I guess in your case and other people, but I know a lot of people who had to get jabbed to keep their job.
Oh yeah.
So it was a lot of pressure.
A lot of pressure. A great deal of pressure.
So I wouldn't say, and that's why I think you need to question. I feel like I want to live I have 2 babies now, and I want them to live in a world where they are free to think for themselves and choose what's good for their own body according to how they feel. Like, just ground yourself, meditate. We're not taught to do that, but I do believe that if you are centered enough, you can take a good decision for yourself, and it will be in harmony with the rest of the community. It shouldn't go against the community. If you think about yourself, it's not selfish to choose something that is good and right for you if it comes from the right place.
No. That's
how
right.
I feel.
If it comes in the
about
right place, I personally think we should be free to do anything we want as long as we don't do harm to others.
Exactly.
That's my basics, and I've come to that actually through the whole issue of the war on drugs, which is another area of central government control that is totally unnecessary, and which is only about encouraging the habit of obedience.
Yeah. Like a lot of things.
There's no doubt that the so-called war on drugs has been a complete and utter failure. It has created enormous criminal enterprises, and it has resulted, in some countries, in people suffering the death sentence for smoking dope. You know, I mean, this is insane.
What?
It's utterly insane.
Not in England.
No, not in England.
Yeah.
You would just go to prison there.
Yeah.
They fuck up your life in some other way.
Is it legal now in weed?
No, not in Britain.
Okay.
They've recently introduced a kind of medical marijuana thing, but it's hardly available to anybody. It's quite difficult to.
I guess in Canada we're
quite difficult to access. I just think that one of the places that governments should stay out of is people's heads. They don't belong there.
Absolutely.
And as long as we follow that golden rule, that we don't do harm to others. I mean, how can a person smoking marijuana or taking a cannabis edible, how can they possibly be harming others?
Yeah.
That's a personal, private decision. The moment they do harm others, we already have laws that govern doing harm to others. We don't need laws that patrol the inner sanctum of our own consciousness. And if we accept and tolerate such laws, then we're accepting and tolerating government interference in every single aspect of our lives.
Yeah, it opens a door for that.
It completely opens the door to it, and it makes it acceptable in many people's minds. The propaganda around the war on drugs is just full of lies. You can still encounter people today who believe that one joint and is going to lead to your ruin of your life. Well, the only way it's going to lead to the ruin of your life is if the police catch you smoking it. And inflict a criminal sentence upon you. Which is the case in many countries. I'm glad that Canada has legalized cannabis.
It's a good way to control.
However, the fact is that that's also come from central government. One of the things I like about America is that the legalization of cannabis has happened from popular initiative state by state. It's been something that people have taken their own power back. Not in every state, but in a great many. And in the process of doing so, they've shown that all the lies and myths about cannabis are indeed lies and myths and not truth. Those states that have legalized cannabis have not fallen to pieces.
Exactly. I think it's the same with the psychedelics in general. They should be legal because first they don't really create addiction. And it's a tool you can use it as a tool to evolve as a human.
And we're seeing a gradual process where this is happening.
But there's been a lot of decades of propaganda against it, so there's a lot to undo. And I would wrap up with this. I think it's you seem to be like a spiritual person, and the word spiritual maybe doesn't mean the same to you than to me, but obviously you are in a journey with ayahuasca and trying to get rid of stuff. You were talking about your migraines.
Well, I've come to realize that we cannot be reduced to matter. There is much more complexity to the human condition than just our bodies, our digestive systems, our skin, our fingernails, our hair.
There's more to that.
The stuff you can weigh and measure and count is in many ways the least important aspect of the human being. It's the stuff you can't weigh and measure and count that is more important. Is that person a kind person? Do they care for others? Are they exploring the mystery of being alive? We're persuaded to think that there's no mystery in being alive, that it's just an accident of chemistry and biology.
Yeah.
To me, the fact of being alive is a huge mystery.
That sounds very disconnected to think that way, but it feels like nowadays science is so important that if you do believe there is something after life, if you believe in reincarnation, if you believe in anything that we can't really prove, you're a psycho.
You're regarded as a complete lunatic.
Exactly.
But my experiences have led me to believe in I think reincarnation is very likely. I think it's very probable. Yeah. And I think the ancient Egyptians had it right, that we're given an incredible opportunity to be born in a human body. And what we must do fundamentally is live up to that opportunity, not waste that gift. And our governments and our large corporations, and I'm sorry to say our large religions, are all teaching us to waste that gift, to limit our inquiry, to limit our relationship to the world within very narrow boundaries that are defined by those large entities, instead of defining our own boundaries, which is what we should be doing.
Is this your mission, you think, in life? Is this how you see your future? Still trying to figure out deeper and deeper within you?
I suppose so, in a way. I regard my mission in life as asking fundamental questions about the stories we're told about ourselves, not just calmly accepting everything that the government says or that archaeology says, but questioning that and questioning it deeply, and doing so in a rational, reasonable way, based on evidence, not just upon fancy. I think it's important to do that, and I intend to continue doing that to the end of my days.
Thanks for doing it. I think we feel very lucky we have you.
Well, it's kind of you to say that. I also feel lucky to be alive, and I'm grateful to my readers who've given me the opportunity to explore the world and to come to my own conclusions about it. And this is why it so offends me when archaeologists and their media friends suggest that I'm some sort of fraud or hoaxer or liar. I've put my life on the line in this investigation for more than 30 years, 7 years of scuba diving in the most difficult conditions all around the world to show that there are structures that were submerged at the end of the Ice Age. The explorations that I've done with psychedelics have often been risky and in risky places in certain ways. But I felt it's right to do that. I don't just want to sit back in an armchair and theorize. I want to put my boots on the ground and explore.
Yeah, and that's the fun part. Well, thanks for your time. It was a very interesting conversation.
Good. Thank you.
Merci d'avoir écouté la vidéo jusqu'à la fin. Si vous avez aimé, mettez un petit pouce par en haut, un commentaire ou partagez-la. C'est une excellente façon de m'aider à rejoindre un maximum de gens. Si ce n'est pas déjà fait, suivez-moi sur toutes mes plateformes, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram et X, là où la censure ne sévit pas. N'oubliez pas de protéger votre vie privée quand vous naviguez Internet avec le VPN le plus rapide sur le marché, NordVPN, N-O-R-D. Abonnez-vous au nordvpn.com/Hello veut savoir et supportez ma chaîne tout en utilisant un des meilleurs VPN au monde. Je répète, nordvpn.com/ELOVEUT-SAVOIR. Et en terminant, si vous avez envie de me supporter directement et voir davantage de contenu comme celui que vous venez juste de regarder, j'accepte les dons mensuels ou uniques par Interac à l'adresse helloveusavoir@gmail.com, mot de passe vérité sans accent, VERITE. Merci!